Ultimately, as a doctor, our job to be done is to help people to feel better. And that word feel is relevant there because it's all about emotions. When a patient comes in with a concern about their face, it isn't necessarily always just to do with the anatomy you see in front of you. I spent a bit of time with this patient talking to him about his issue, why it concerned him so much, and that really was a bit of a light bulb moment for me in recognising the role of the face in particular in one sense of identity. That was the birth of this idea of facial optomyography that we patented, which basically is the core of our technology that we call OptoSense.
Hey everyone, this week I am joined by Charles Nduka, and he is the founder of Emteq. Now, I'm going to let Charles explain exactly what Emteq does, but we did a bit of work together a long time ago, and Graham, who was the CEO at the time, came onto this podcast to talk about the whole story of Emteq quite a long time ago. Now, I don't expect anyone listening now to remember. There'll be a few OGs that listen to this that will probably remember that, but there won't be many. So I'm going to let Charles explain all of that in a second. But before we get into Emteq and everything that you're up to, Charles, how are you? It's been a while.
It has. I think it's about 4 years since we were last in touch. It's been, the world has changed. We've had financial crises, multiple
financial crises, yeah. Multiple once in a lifetime events in finance, which has been fantastic. As you're trying to build a bit of wealth.
We've had that, which obviously has impacted on sort of fundraising. We've had the government change, we've had the pandemic finish, we've had war breakout in Ukraine, we've had war breakout in the Middle East, we've had all sorts of things. But we're still here, pushing forward, and it's a really exciting time just now.
Doing our best, aren't we, Charles? We're all just muddling through, trying to do our best. So listen, man, the other thing that's happened is the world has sort of caught up with what you've been talking about for at least the last 4 years, which is super interesting. Everything that you have been part of for all of that time, things like simply VR and where we are with the metaverse and things like that. The other things are, I guess, the value of empathy and human emotion and where that plays in healthcare at a time where cognition is now commoditized, the phrase that I learned on the last podcast that I did with ChatGPT and AI and all the other LLMs, basically just removing the need for a lot of cognition and certainly removing the need for memorizing facts. And so it's super interesting, the things that you've been talking about for a long time, watching the world now catch up. And actually, the sheer value, I think, of what you have in understanding emotions, the use of VR. And before I give away too much on that, I guess I'll hand over to you, Charles, to just explain a little bit about yourself and your story, because it's obviously fascinating where you've got to in your career, completely independent of Emteq and founding the company. So give the listeners a bit of a flavour. What have you been up to get to this point? Tell me about your other career and also tell me about Emteq.
Where do I start? So, I'm a plastic reconstructive surgeon by background. I've always been interested in the effect of being, I guess, a bit outside or be seen as an outsider on the person. That may have a sort of a deep background in my dad having come to the UK back in the 1960s, sort of the civil war that was going on in Nigeria and the impact of that sort of landing here in the UK and, just seeing some of the struggles that the family went through at that time. I think being aware of being seen as other on a person and its impact on mental health and other things definitely left an impression on me. Sadly, I had two siblings with significant mental health issues. My sister developed schizophrenia actually from age sort of 12, and she sadly is no longer with us. She died in her early 20s, and my brother, who was 4 years older than me, he had a sort of breakdown, depression, actually took his own life. Too. So I've always been very strongly aware of the role of being outside, if you like, on a person. And I decided to become a plastic surgeon, perhaps as the sort of, my dad was an engineer, so always being aware of the potential role of doing something practical to try and, I guess, fix a problem. And that maybe is a bias. Now I'm reflecting more and more about that just now, and why did I choose this career out of the many others. But yeah, so I went to university. I did psychological disorders as part of my intercollegiate degree at university. Again, to explore that interest in the brain and how the brain affects the body and how the body affects one's perspective. And then plastic surgery was something I was just really, really drawn to. When I was in training, I met a patient he'd been seen by the consultant who I was under for quite a few months, and the patient was very, very distressed. The consultant said, I don't know why he keeps coming back, because he's only got a very minor issue. Essentially, this patient just couldn't raise one eyebrow, and I spent a bit of time with this patient talking to him about his issue, why it concerned him so much, and it was only really after quite a long chat that he revealed that he'd been tortured. He was from Iraq.
Whoa.
He'd been tortured by Saddam Hussein's henchmen for weeks and months. They'd sort of beaten him in all sorts of places around his body, but the one thing that really affected him was he was hit with a blunt instrument. I think the butt of a rifle or something on his head, and they basically damaged the branch of the facial nerve that supplies the forward muscle. And this meant that every single morning, the first thing you do in the morning, last thing you do at night, is to go to the bathroom, look in the mirror, and this visual signifier of that time, that most terrible time of his life, was just there looking him in the face. And what was really interesting was that it was a very simple thing to do to address for him, was just to actually rebalance his brow. The impact on his whole psyche, his whole demeanor was incredible. And that really was a bit of a light bulb moment for me in recognizing the role of the face in particular in one's sense of identity, and how it makes a person feel. So I met, subsequent to that, I met a surgeon called Daniel Labbe, who's a French facial paralysis surgeon who was getting some really great results with the technique he developed. And I went out to France, studied with him.
Wow.
Went to Brazil. Daniel came to Brazil as well. Worked with another surgeon who he'd known called Fausto Viterbo, and then really developed a passion for facial palsy, facial paralysis surgery. And so when I became a consultant myself at the Queen Victoria Hospital, which is in East Grinstead, this is a hospital that was made famous by the work of someone called Sir Archibald Mackinder, who was a surgeon who worked on the pilots of the Second World War.
Wow.
Who had been damaged and burnt and injured. And his story actually was also very, very impactful for me, because he really saw the important role of seeing the patient holistically. These were pilots who, at the peak of their powers in terms of there was young, dashing Spitfire pilots, and suddenly they were brought low by having faces and bodies burnt and damaged by their war efforts. And he really put them back together, not just physically, but also psychologically. They were effectively known as the guinea pigs, and he insisted that they didn't have to wear uniforms, as most military patients had to. He really sort of focused on the role of social interaction, both within the hospital, but also within the town. There's a book written about him called, I think, the man who stopped the town from staring. Just because these patients were having to have some really extraordinary procedures. He was grafting bits of tissue from other parts of the body. So, for example, you may have your nose attached to your shoulder for weeks at a time to allow the fresh tissue to be brought in, and then that would be detached, and he would waltz tissue up the body to the face to enable transplantation of tissue. A really innovative surgeon, and because these techniques were in many cases new, and these patients were essentially, guinea pigs. They called themselves the Guinea Pig Club, and actually, sadly, that the last members only died quite recently. And actually, it was actually the 60th anniversary the 65th anniversary of Mackinder's death, just literally this month.
Oh,
So and obviously it was VE Day as well, just recently,
of
which is
course.
kind of I wrote a short blog about it on my Substack because he was such an important person. He really recognized the importance of taking a holistic approach to both medicine, in his case, reconstructive surgery, and and the psyche, and
Mm.
how the mind and body work together. Anyway, so I started at Queen Victoria Hospital initially in 2005 as locum, then took my full-time post and set up the facial palsy service in 2007. And from the beginning, I really was keen to work closely with colleagues and a multidisciplinary team, and also with patients. And in 2012, with the encouragement of some patients, in particular somebody called Karen Johnson, who at the time she was born with facial palsy. She developed a website herself to help provide information to people because it's such a difficult thing to learn about. It's a
Mm.
relatively rare condition. Um, and we founded a charity, Facial Palsy UK, in 2012, which has been amazing, working with some fantastic volunteers, amazing trustees, amazing colleagues on the medical advisory board. The website now gets something like just under 500,000 hits a year,
Mm.
unique visitors a year. Actually, many of them from outside the UK, just providing comprehensive information on this condition. And it's just and also as a doctor, facial paralysis, most commonly people recognize it as Bell's palsy,
Mm.
but it's also can be caused by 50 other causes, including infections, including accidents, including tumors, a whole range
Mm.
of things can cause it. And because it's a relatively rare condition, the management was really, really very poor. When I set up
Mm.
the service, we had patients coming in, oftentimes 5, 10, even 20 years post paralysis. They
Mm.
found out about us through various routes and were coming from all over the country. So one thing we were trying to do with the charity was trying to ensure that there was sufficient numbers of services like ours across the UK, and gratefully, over the last dozen years or so, the number has increased and patients aren't having to wait so long. In doing that facial palsy surgery, sometimes you're having to do very long operations, 6 hours, sometimes longer, transplanting nerves and muscles to try to help people to improve their symmetry, at least at rest, and ideally to help them to smile, the thing that people most often miss. But it perplexed me why sometimes patients who clearly had a big problem to solve, it affected them tremendously psychologically, as we demonstrated in published research. But then sometimes they weren't able to do the exercises that were required to help the brain to relearn how to use this newly transplanted ability.
Right.
And it's funny because it's a problem that all doctors really experience. You tell patients that, okay, well, this is the treatment or this is what you have to do, but sometimes it's actually really difficult for them to do that. And we don't have any way of helping
Yeah.
them. In our case, we got patients to do something called mirror biofeedback. So they look in a mirror and they practice expressing with their unaffected side, with their reconstructed side. But the problem is that if you've just had an operation, sometimes looking in the mirror repeatedly, many times a day, is
Of course.
psychologically very uncomfortable.
Mm.
In many cases, patients don't want to look in the mirror in any
Mm.
case, let alone after you've just had an operation. But it does mean that we couldn't really maximize the benefits of our treatments, be it surgical or non-surgical, if the patients weren't able to get feedback on their expressions. And so we did some initial work seeing whether we could um, abstract away the expressions by using technology, initially using an iPad
Mm.
app to use computer vision and show like a representation. But the problem is that we know that we need to get more feedback because patients can often do quite a good posed smile, but when they're in the moment, enjoying or laughing spontaneously, then they'll go back to their asymmetric expressions. And so we use a system called EMG, electromyography, which is basically like measuring heart signals from the ECG, but this is for muscles outside of the heart. So electromyography is an old technology, decades old, involves putting electrodes on the skin, and when you do a movement, you can see it as a representation on the screen. And one day a patient asked me, why can't I have one of these at home? Because I can see how valuable it is to see even small movements represented on a screen. I could wear this and get feedback continuously about what I'm doing. I said, well, of course you can't because this costs £10,000. It's an expensive piece of device. But, it set me thinking, because when I looked at this device, the actual components of it were just a few £100s. So why was it £10,000? Why couldn't he have one? He was asking this question, and it sort of set me down this path of thinking, well, could we develop something that patients could actually use? Anyway, it was an itch I had to scratch, and so I applied for funding, and on second go got funding from the National Institute for Health Research here in the UK to do a pilot development project working with partners, Professor Philip Breeden in Nottingham and Professor Ala Shapura, who's a health economist in Coventry, and then working with Facial Palsy UK and some patient representatives who could give us feedback on what we were working on. And we set up a project, essentially an R&D project around this. We got to the end of the project, and actually, so I had to spin out that as a company to enable that project to happen, because basically it was an innovation funding for companies rather than for hospitals. It was called a Product Development Award, but then realised that actually, for what is a relatively rare condition such as facial palsy, the unit cost would end up being actually quite high, in many thousands, because you don't have, making hardware is expensive, and the cost of regulatory approvals is also really, really high. But because I'd done that work previously on psychological disorders at university, I did know that electromyography, EMG, is used in neuroscience and psychology to study emotions. Hence the idea of saying, well, if we could find use cases beyond facial palsy for this technology, then that would enable us to reduce the unit cost tremendously, and therefore make it available and cost effective for patients to have as their sort of home-based coach on their expressions and so forth. So that was kind of the beginnings of this. And then around the same sort of time, there's a lot of excitement around VR, and that was obviously really useful, because you had this system where you could see on a screen your data. You could practice potentially interactions on that, and then use the sensors to give feedback to the individual. The difficulty we had there was that we developed this technology called Emteq Pro, and it was used by researchers, used by us to do some really, really, really exciting research we can talk about later on, perhaps. But it was still quite expensive and quite bulky. And the thing about VR is that it's used episodically. You'd, a bit like watching TV, you actually go to a destination, if you like, and use it. It's not something you would have in your day-to-day life. And so the idea, which had originally been planted about having something that was in glasses, was always in the back of my mind. How could we do that? How could we try and sense the face in a form factor that people will be willing to wear continuously? Because by doing that, you get much better data, much better improvements, and also it could be used for other things that also affect the face, such as mental health conditions such as depression, bipolar, such as social interaction training through things like autism, conditions that affect the face like Parkinson's disease, etc., etc. And then a strange thing happened very, very early one morning. I know this because I actually recorded it on my phone, because it was one of those moments that you just knew was really significant.
Wow.
And this idea came to me that we didn't have to use a sensor on the skin as EMG does. If you ever try to swat a fly, you know that's really difficult, because they manage to vanish away before you're even close to it. And the reason why they do that is because their vision isn't as ours is, where we create an image. They just see a flow of movement called optical flow across their sensors. And so this tiny brain of a fly is able to evade a brain many, many thousands of times bigger than it, because it's basically seeing at a very high frame rate. So your hand that you think is moving quickly is moving actually really, really slowly towards it. And so, this idea of using optical flow sensors to track muscle movements. I basically imagined a fly sitting on my glasses, and what it would see when I smiled. And it would see the texture of my skin moving across its visual field. And so that was the birth of this idea of facial optomyography that we patented and which basically is the core of our technology that we call OcoSense. The name is derived from the name of the sensor on the fly's back called an ocelli, which is OCCELLI. So it's been a kind of a mad journey. So EMG is amazing. It's a gold standard, and we've used it to validate our technology. We did a huge study at the Science Museum in London, which someone called Roger Highfield, who's the director there, helped us to set up, enabled us to prove out with a fantastic researcher called Ifi Mavridou, who did a PhD with us, that we could actually measure emotional responses called affective responses in people. She created basically 3 scenarios: a positive, neutral, and a negative scenario. And people filled out sort of personality and psychographic data and see how people responded emotionally to these different emotionally evocative scenarios. And that was the core of our model around measuring emotional responses based on facial expressions. And then we basically transplanted that core model into the glasses-based system, and which is now being used by researchers. So it's been a really, really long journey to get to this point, and it's just so exciting now that the idea that was kind of planted as a seed from those clinical interactions is now being instantiated in a device that will hopefully help a lot of people in the future.
That is an amazing story, Charles, honestly. And even going right back to the beginning and thinking about, I guess, how your personal stories, and thank you for sharing that, by the way. I didn't know about that previously, about what happened to your siblings and things. And I think it always fascinates me, what motivates people and where the sort of meaning comes from. And I think you've obviously got so much meaning, and a lot of that I relate to, actually, in the sense of, seen as the other. My dad my dad is African, trained as a nurse, came over from Mauritius on a boat when he was 18, and, black male nurse in the 60s, that can't have been easy, very much othered. I've walked on the street and seen him othered and heard him othered in his face, as a child. These experiences sit with you, don't they, like, for a long time. And I'm sure you've got a lot of that stuff personally as well, more so than me, I think. And I think in some way, I was like, someone actually asked me the other day, like, why am I so obsessed with community? Why am I so obsessed with, like, building community in health tech and around all the media stuff and setting up the next gen community for the next generation to have a voice? And, like, why am I trying to, like, so hard to, like, do these things that seemingly don't have much commercial value but seem to be scratching some sort of itch? And it's like, I don't know, but I think a part of life is that we find meaning and we find purpose from wherever it comes from, and it can be seen as adversity, but it can also be seen as privilege, because actually the anxiety does seem to disappear somewhat when you're taking action against something that's to do with your purpose. And there's a beauty in that, I think. Yes. And that's quite nice. And I think part of the goal in life is to figure out what that is for you, and to figure out what that is for the people listening, of what is it that's actually going to not make you care as much about the financial rewards or whatever it is, and finding whatever it is that's going to drive you. And I think that you told that story so beautifully about your personal side, but also the medical side as well. I think as a plastic surgeon, there's an interesting equation that sort of comes into my mind that hadn't ever come into my mind previously, that when you talked about holistic look at patients, when you talked about the face and identity, I think it's very easy in medicine to reduce things to cause, symptoms, diagnosis, treatment. And actually, in the example that you gave about someone that was tortured under the Saddam Hussein regime, hit on the head with a rifle, and every time they look in the mirror, that's what they think. People in healthcare and people in health tech, like, you can build a solution with a market size, and you could talk in these terms, right? And you can talk about these things. But when you've been a clinician, you've spoken to that patient and you've understood that story, it is almost impossible like with even the lowest level of empathy, that to not connect with that and to not think like, hey, there's a metric, there's a measurement, there's a number, there's some sort of energy, or there's some quantifiable thing that we're not quantifying here, that story is full of. There's a reason for doing this that seems to transcend financial metrics and how much time and energy it's going to take me. And there's some sort of like connectivity or empathy, or there's some sort of score there that exceeds the maximum amount of, that isn't in a lot of other places, that I think as humans we haven't figured out what that is yet. But I think there's a lot of answers in whatever that question is. Like,
yes.
And I can't quite put my hand on that, and that's very poorly explained from me. So kudos if you've understood that correctly. But it's like,
I think it was, I mean, ultimately, as a doctor, as a health professional of any kind, to be honest, in business they talk about this job to be done. Our job to be done is to help people to feel better. And that word "feel" is relevant there, because it's all about emotions. And I apologize to many of my patients who end up sitting outside in the waiting room while my clinic overruns yet again, is because sometimes it's actually the conversation is the therapy, is the way that you help the patient, because you have to really understand what is the root cause. When a patient comes in with a concern about their face, it isn't necessarily always just to do with the anatomy you see in front of you. And we actually did research on this, because I was so perplexed why sometimes you'll see patients with a very marked degree of asymmetry, facial asymmetry, and it's like, yeah, doc, just help me, just stop my eye from watering, and just stop me dribbling, and I'm fine. Even though they have a very marked asymmetry, and other patients who have a relatively mild asymmetry, and it's destroyed their life. They've given up their job, they are not going out, they're socially isolated, they're very depressed. We studied this, and there's a really very low correlation between the severity of palsy as measured with our standardized tools and the anxiety and depressive symptoms. And so it's really trying to get to that core and say, with plastic surgery, it's interesting that a lot of my colleagues are slightly perplexed by, why would you spend all this time and effort to become a consultant plastic surgeon, which is, as you can imagine, because of its potential financial rewards, highly sought after as a career.
Indeed.
Why do you do that? Climb this ladder and then spend so much time, effort, and money to try and address this thing? But I say it's actually the same job. As a plastic surgeon, your core role is to help patients see what's in their mind eye. So in the case of somebody who's having even an aesthetic improvement, they have a vision, they have an image of themselves that isn't reflected in the mirror when they see themselves in the morning. Same with somebody with facial palsy, it's the same thing. They even talk about this loss of identity. I don't recognize myself anymore. They'll often say that if they've developed a facial palsy, due to infection or accident, etc. And that personality schism, if you like, is tremendously depressing, because they can often forget about it when they're in the world, and then suddenly they'll catch a reflection in a shop mirror, or somebody will take a photograph without them knowing when they're in a social setting, and then it'll be posted online, and it will suddenly just come rushing back to them. A patient said to me once, they said this expression which really stuck with me, that they say that fish discover water last. And I sort of obviously looked at them quizzically, and I said, well, it's only when that fish is pulled out of water and they suddenly realized this thing that was around them, this thing that they had all the time, they took it for granted. And only when you lose your ability to express yourself and express yourself how you intended to, do you realize what it is that you've lost. And so it's that is, it's at the core of what we do as a doctor. You're trying to help people to feel better. In some cases, it's with a tablet. In some cases, with an operation procedure. In some cases, it's just with information and helping people to, to see themselves differently, or perhaps to marry what's in their mind's eye with what is actually in the mirror, what others see.
I think if anyone listening is in any doubt at all of why we need to increase the efficiency of healthcare, then they should replay what you have just said, because I think a lot of narrative around AI, we've got the ambient scribes, you've got this, like we can increase throughput, we can do more, doctors can see more patients, like more. Like what you've just described is that actually when you're allowed to deliver a standard of care that you want to deliver, it takes time, because you're a surgeon, you should love cutting, you should, and you do, I'm sure.
I do,
You
yes,
do,
I do.
you
It's
absolutely
time.
love it.
Yeah, absolutely. Time disappears. When you're in flow in
And
surgery. Yeah.
absolutely. But you also love solving the problem. And you see that as your role. You don't have to love it even, but you see it as your role to make the patient feel better. That takes time. And as we get more tools, call them AI or otherwise, I don't care. But as we improve healthcare, as we improve the efficiency of healthcare, we need to ring fence or increase the amount of time doctors have to see patients and select people for their ability to do what you can do so well. Because you can just tell, Charles, that you care, right? Like you care about these patients. Do you find it hard, by the way? Like, it might be a stupid question, but like you do seem so connected to your job and these people as patients. Like, do you have really difficult days with this?
I mean, it's very rare for there not to be tears in one clinic. It's very, very rare. Last clinic patient, she's a TV presenter. Could you imagine that your
Wow.
whole career is based around being able to deliver information in a way that's not distracting to the viewer, and you develop a facial paralysis, in her case, actually as a result, or through pregnancy. Pregnancy is one of the risk factors for developing Bell's palsy, which didn't fully
Right.
recover. And yeah, I mean, totally. We talk about how difficult it could be to look in the mirror twice a day. If you're going to be on camera, on screen, and dealing with the consequences of a facial paralysis, it's tremendously difficult. And so, yeah, it's a very emotional time.
Mm.
And this is why I'm really lucky working with an amazing team of facial therapists and psychological therapists and other colleagues, because it cuts to the heart of a person's identity. It really
Mm.
does.
The story that you then went on to go and tell about Emteq and founding the company, like this is the establishing like the meaning for this and your purpose for this it's so incredibly clear, and what a driving force you have to go and solve all of these problems. It's incredible. And it's the first thing I actually want to ask you about is this sort of light bulb moment. Now, obviously, that you thought about Emteq, you thought about the way that the company could be built, or the product, the device could be built, and that story is very much aligned with how a lot of people on this podcast talk about. Very rarely do we hear about light bulb moments, actually, but this sense and this feeling of, hey, this is what a fly does. This is how a fly will analyze movement. Hey, let's now think about the physiology of and the expression of emotion and what actually happens, and looking into that detail and that kind of light bulb moment. What do you think contributed to that? Because I think a lot of people want these light bulb moments. A lot of people. I've actually read a book on ideas and how to get ideas, and a lot of things. A lot of the narrative in there is like, don't walk the same route every single day, vary your environment, like a lot of that sort of stuff. And another school of thought seems to be, do everything you can to create the environment for ideas, and then put no pressure on yourself. Like, let the idea be a gift. Let the idea be a
Yes.
gift for the work that you put in to just creating the right environment. So light bulb moments. I rarely get to ask someone about light bulb moments because it very rarely happens. So I'm interested in yours. Like, what do you think led to that?
That's interesting. I mean, I think you can. People talk about being able to ask your subconscious about things, and
Interesting.
that if you go to bed I think Thomas Edison did this apparently. So he used to sort of, I think something about him saying he used to go to bed and ask his subconscious to solve this problem. And it was really interesting in this case because literally, I get up very early in the morning. I woke up, whatever 5:30. It was still dark. I didn't put the lights on, and I was in the bathroom, and the moonlight was shining through the trees outside, and it was windy, and the branches of the trees were putting a shadow across the window, and it was that evoked this idea of the movement, and which sort of triggered this thing. And I mean, in my case, I've always been really into biology. I've always been into nature, and much of what we do is based around biological processes because basically you can't trump millions of years of evolution.
Absolutely.
People sort of worry about AI and doing this, that, and the other, but don't forget that the human brain runs on 20 watts of power. It's a tiny amount of energy. It's highly efficient, and so you can't really compare this incredible capacity that we have as humans compared with these large language models, which are hugely energy intensive. And then in this case of the fly, I guess it's just kind of thinking like, why can't I best this thing that's tiny? And then just going back to first principles and keep asking why. And that's the other thing. Actually, I read a book years ago, and in fact, if there are any entrepreneurs listening, I really strongly recommend reading this book called Lean Startup by someone called Eric Ries, and he talks a lot about this philosophy of sort of cutting to the core. And when you have a problem occurring, you just keep asking why. Let's call it the 5 whys, and it comes from the Japanese manufacturing process. He gives a really great anecdote in this about when Toyota would look.
I was going to say, is it Toyota? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they had this. It's fascinating, but just he had this anecdote about when they tried to produce a factory, Toyota, in America, because basically they were overtaking the American auto industry because they were very much more efficient, had better quality. In visiting one of the car factories there, they found an American car factory. Said, "Oh well, this is where we fix all the cars," and all these guys, like 4 or 5 guys, like checking all the door openings and closures and adjusting the frame, this, that, and the other, and little mallets to improve things. And the Toyota representative said, "Why didn't you just do it correctly the first time?" because they got a system there, the Toyota production system, basically that everyone on the production line is empowered with a thing called the andon cord. It's like a cord, or there are multiple cords along the production line, and everyone from the cleaner to the engineer, anyone is empowered that if they see something wrong going on, anything to do with the production of this vehicle, they pull this cord and the whole thing will stop. At the cost of tens, hundreds of thousands of yen.
Yeah.
But people are rewarded for doing that, and the point is that if you can get to the root cause of problems, you can have a small defect that occurs early on in the production process, but that's going to be manifested later on.
Yeah,
of course. By having that philosophy of the 5 whys, keep asking why when a problem occurs, gets to the root cause, and that philosophy. When I read that, I was thinking a lot about healthcare and how so often in healthcare, there's a problem that appears and you want to add a solution rather than asking the 5 whys. A patient comes to my clinic and they need to have surgery, but I can't operate on them because they're smoking. And I ask, well, I can't operate on you because it's going to impact on the result because the blood supply, etc. But then I think, well, why are they smoking? And then, I dig into it. Well, I found I'm really struggling with my weight, and in many cases, many female patients who smoke, it's because it's a useful way of managing their weight. Well, why is the weight an issue? Well, I really struggle because I have a really stressful job, and I find that when the stress gets too much, I find that I want to kind of I have a binge, and I had this food, and then what is it you're eating? Well, I worked long hours, and anything was available. So you go back and you actually realize that so much of the root core problem there is emotional, i.e. the stress, and how they manage the stress or don't manage the stress, and then the kinds of food that they're eating, and it's been embarrassing to realize just how poor our education as doctors is around dietary health and its impact on both our behavior and our moods. And this is something that we're really sort of leaning into just now with some work we've been doing with glasses. So yeah, that five whys approach, I keep asking why. Then you realize actually when you look at the top 10 causes of premature death and you ask the five whys, if you ask most people, say, what the biggest cause of death, they'll say, well, cardiovascular disease. Well, people don't have a heart attack from nothing. Typically, it's related to things like smoking, things like poor diet, and lack of exercise. If you ask the five whys of those things, it comes back down to those two things: the diet and the emotions. The reason why people don't exercise is oftentimes because they're either too stressed, haven't got enough time, or they don't feel motivated enough. Even though exercise is by far, in the way, the most effective antidepressant that exists. A big review published in BMJ showed that. If you ask people why somebody have a stroke, oh, they had raised blood pressure. Why they've got raised blood pressure? The majority of it is because of diet, high salt diet, and lack of exercise. Why aren't they exercising? It literally comes back down to it. I didn't realize until 2 years ago that 30% of solid cancers are due to obesity. Obesity is a massive issue now. Obviously, people talk about it a lot to do with GLP-1s, etc. But obesity as a cause of both cardiovascular disease, as a cause of type 2 diabetes, which themselves are causes of premature death, is huge. And then obviously things like Alzheimer's, which is growing in its prevalence, which again is hugely to do with metabolism. Again, diet. It's estimated that between 30 and 40% of Alzheimer's is related to diet. Obviously, a big chunk of the other parts of it are to do with lifestyle. Again, things like exercise. If you have a major break of a bone, hip fracture, for example, and you're over 70, there's something like an 80% risk of death within the year. It's something, I need to check the figure, but it's something like that. That's sort of order of magnitude. It's a massively high risk. Now, what's the risk of a fall? Well, it's due to instability, lack of muscle strength. Again, it comes back down to those behaviors. And so it's been really interesting for me just digging into the research and asking that why, and realizing that we've done a really good job in understanding, say, sleep. We've got devices now like Oura Ring and others that help us to understand that. We've done a really good job on perhaps understanding physical activities, the pedometer, step counting via your Apple Watch or your Fitbit, etc., your Whoop device. But we really haven't done a good job at all on understanding those other two big pillars of health. That's, say, dietary health and emotional health. And the glasses certainly have a role to play on emotional health. We worked with somebody called Professor James Stone, who's a psychiatrist and neuroscientist at Sussex University, with the glasses, and he did a study that was published in Frontiers in Psychiatry that showed that the glasses can distinguish between depressed and non-depressed people using this sort of standardized protocol where they are exposed to effective, emotionally stimulating material, which is amazing. And he's looking to apply for further funding to develop that program further. That study was done in a lab. The next phase is to do that work in the real world and to look at things like bipolar disorder as well. Super fascinating. We work with a researcher called Lisa Feldman Barrett and her colleague Karen Quigley, who do some amazing work and who's really revolutionized our understanding of emotional responses. I mean, she doesn't like the word facial expression because it's true, it is facial movements rather than expressions. But the core of this is that we do respond to our environments. Each person has a personalized response to their environment. And so you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach, but as long as you take that into account and the context of their response, well, in much the same way that you learn from your loved ones, your partner, your family members, you learn or can infer how they're going to behave based on their expressions and their movements, well, so too can technology. And you can now develop personalized models to understand mood.
Yes. And this is what I want to come on to, Charles, because I think this is where you were ahead of your time, I think, 5 years ago with this, because as the conversations that I've been having recently about where AI is taking us, and I don't like using the term AI really in this context too much, but it's basically where technology is taking us, that technology broadly is taking things off our plate. It's taking cognition and thinking off our plate. And, I've talked to people about the people that say, "Oh, we're past peak human. Like we're not going to have to do the same level of research and thinking and analysis and all this sort of stuff because LLMs are going to do it and this is going to do it and that's going to do it." But it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think a lot of that energy that we were spending, it's like calculators. Yeah, like I said this on the last episode, it's like calculators coming along. Like, yeah, we're not going to do long division on paper anymore. We're going to lose the ability to do long division like on paper, but we're going to redistribute that energy into something else now. And then we went and built computers, and then we built like the next thing and all the rest of it. But I think there is probably, broadly, there's going to be a redistribution of what peak human actually means, to go from memorizing facts and doing research that computers can do. And I think we are going to have, especially in healthcare, by the way, we're going to have more of a view and a vision and an understanding of emotions, because it is going to make healthcare better for all the obvious reasons you've talked about in plastic surgery and plastics broadly, and like everything that you've mentioned about the ability for people to feel better because of lots of different things. The analysis of emotion there is obviously incredibly important in mental health, distinguishing how depressed people are on a spectrum and a scale, and bipolar and all the conditions that you've mentioned. This allowing us to read things from that perspective. But I almost think of it as well the other way round, of the clinicians, because again, a lot of the thinking and talking that I've been doing with people now is the more that we can understand what level of emotion is required in a certain clinical interaction, from a cancer diagnosis at one end to, I don't know, just a bog standard GP appointment about your little toe fungus, I don't know, like at the other end, they require very different emotions. They require a very different EQ profile. And actually, can we start to read people better for their ability to deliver empathy? And that rather than just going for, self-directed guidance in medicine of where we end up best, can we actually start reading that better of people and reading that better of situations? Is a new age clinical skills training going to look more like people with Emteq glasses on and then getting a score of, well, you read the emotions right or wrong and you delivered the emotions right and wrong, and here's some feedback and some learning? And can we teach people how to make people feel better to an optimal level, not just going, well, this person's pretty good at it, so we'll stick them in palliative care? Or like, can we actually teach this a lot better and show people so people can learn it? And I think there's going to be a redistribution, I think, of how important it is that we learn these things. So it feels to me like you're perfectly primed with the device. And so with that in mind, I guess, can you just talk about like high level summary, what the device is, what the device does in various different areas that you're focusing on, from research to clinical applications and all these different things? Just give me like the top line view, and yeah, I guess what you're looking to do with it in the next few years.
It's about so many different ideas you just said. Yeah. So broadly speaking, this technology is around understanding human behavior in a way that is unobtrusive, that allows information to be gathered in the real world, and that is as objective as one can be, which is clearly really important. For researchers, up until now, most research is done using some form of questionnaire or survey or some kind of retrospective view. And the big problem with that is that you end up having to make correlations, or you're having to rely on recall, which obviously can be biased by both memory or people filtering themselves, which is a huge problem. And the subjectivity means that all sorts of things can happen that one didn't intend, which is why we're trying to improve the way that people, for example, are selected for a role. Because if you can be affected, if you can be influenced by a person's appearance, for example, and make selections based on that and those preferences rather than their performance, then that's not good. And we know this now. And this is why many orchestras, for example, do blind auditions where the person is performing behind the screen. It doesn't happen so much in healthcare, but we know this. The data is very clear that we're not very good at selecting people based purely on performance, based on purely objective measures. In terms of healthcare providers, there's a really important role, as you say, with the clinician as therapeutic agent. And by that, I mean, we can think of giving a person a painkiller, paracetamol, they've got some pain. But we know from huge amounts of research that there is a massive role of the person giving the pill in the response that the person experiences, the placebo effect. And that's actually up to 30% of the effect is due to placebo.
30? 30?
30, yeah, it's huge. It's huge. And bizarrely, and I read this book recently, actually recommended to me by a trainee, we'll put the link in the show notes, about surgery and the placebo effect. I mean, they've done, I don't know how they've got ethics for this, but they've done operations on people where, for example, people with knee pain traditionally in the past used to automatically get an arthroscopy, heel surgery, look in the knee, trim some cartilage, whatever, and it's been shown it doesn't work. And they've done sham surgery where they've actually made incisions in the knee so that the patient thinks they've had surgery, or at least everyone's blinded, it's a triple blind, so the surgeon's done the operation, the patient's got the incisions, they've got the dressing and everything else, and only afterwards they realise which one people actually had the true washout and people who had the sham surgery. And
that's a WHO checklist nightmare. Triple blind.
Yes, it is. It's incredible that they got permission to do it, but it's been done on numerous occasions, and it has to be done in a way because if you're introducing a new surgical procedure, especially if it's for things like pain, then you need to have something objective to make sure that it works. Because unfortunately, when you do something like put incision on a patient, a big chunk of their improvement is the placebo effect. So realizing that. The clinician, be they a doctor, a dietitian, a nurse, have a really important therapeutic role in how a person responds to that treatment, that advice. It means that we really have to think about these things and think about the ways previously we selected people to go into medicine, for example, where
I agree.
You have to be a memory bank. You have to have a really good memory and to be able to regurgitate facts on an exam sheet.
And be captain of every sports team and play every instrument and all the rest of it. Yeah,
exactly. And have to give up all those things when you become a doctor. But most people who've had misfortune of having to interact with the health system will at some point come across a clinician who is clearly very, very bright, knows a huge amount, but has very, very little in the way of emotional intelligence. But it's important because, as we said at the very beginning, that interaction is about how a person feels. And if we recognize that the clinician has a therapeutic role, then we should actually optimize for that, shouldn't we? Given that the effects, as I say, can be actually in many cases bigger than the effect sizes of many of the drugs that we commonly prescribe. If we think about the effect size of certain antidepressants, for example, when you look in the data, you'll see that the actual size of improvement is actually really, really modest. And a big part of it is, if you look at the randomized controlled trials and what they're comparing, you'll see baseline and you'll see the results, and they'll be like this. But the patients who didn't have a drug, they all have had an improvement because of the randomized trial. They had the placebo. So it's really important. So we need to... we can't improve what we can't measure. If we can measure these so-called soft skills to enable people to improve, well, why shouldn't we? We do the same thing for surgery. One of our advisors, our first investor actually, and my mentor, Lord Aradazi, he was one of the pioneers in keyhole surgery. A huge part of what he did was about simulation surgery. So using simulators to improve outcomes for patients, because you don't want people to be potentially harmed by practicing in real life. You want to practice in a safe way, much in the same way that airline pilots do, and we've made flight now probably the safest way of traveling through use of simulation, through use of measurement tools, sensors. Same is happening with surgery. Well, why shouldn't it happen with that therapeutic interaction, the doctor-patient relationship? And so technology could help to improve that. And likewise, a project really excited about that's starting later on this year with Professor Simon Baron-Cohen, who's one of the world leading experts in autism. Can we improve the lives of those, for example, with autistic spectrum disorders or conditions, their ability to interact socially? Because in that case, a huge part of the morbidity of that condition, or that state, I should say, is to do with social isolation. There's an acceptably high suicide rate amongst people with autism, an acceptably high unemployment rate, because that barrier to employment is the interview. And if you've never had a chance to practice this fundamental thing we're doing just now, just interacting with the person even on screen in a way that will give them enough encouragement and confidence to give a person a job, well, then you can't better yourself. You're going to be on a lower income, fewer opportunities, and the consequences are very severe. The cost in the UK, the last thing it was looked at by, I think the King's Fund, it was something like 30 billion a year. These are just the social costs of autistic spectrum conditions on people. And so the ability to develop technology that can allow people to both measure and improve their social interactions. This is for clinicians, doctors, nurses, and other health professionals. The ability to help end users, those with facial palsy, for example, to help practice their expressions in a safe environment, a simulated environment, so they can go out in the world with more confidence. And those with autism to do the same thing. I see that as being hugely valuable, and we're hopefully going to make it a reality with the help of our partners, researchers, and investors.
Amazing. Charles, it's been an absolute pleasure. Before I let you go, just to be quite specific here, I'm so pleased this exists in a time where, like, I've been banging this drum for a little while, that I think there's something here. There's definitely something about our requirement now that we're starting to free ourselves up from some of the stuff, or at least we're plotting that path to freeing ourselves up as clinicians and as people in healthcare from some of the memorizing facts and compute power of our brains versus compute power of LLMs, etc. Like, we're starting to free ourselves up there. It's been a feeling I've had for some time, perhaps planted way back when we started working together, that there's room for analysing emotions. And what my friend David Neal said in the Netherlands, where we're 150 years behind analysing the role of humans in healthcare, is there not a dose-dependent amount of emotion and empathy in each clinical situation that we could start applying here and researching that? I think it's so important. So before I let you go, just so there's some real focus value here for perhaps making the Healthtech space a bit better, what exact engagement are you looking for from researchers here? What type of researchers should be using your device? And in what environments? What type of research should they be doing? What researchers are you looking to get here?
Well, we're doing some great research with Professor Martin Yeomans on dietary behaviours, but in just scratching the surface, we realise there's so many different areas around diet and healthcare that are unexplored, and it's something that people can do today. We have the technology now. Our current version of our glasses has been stripped down to enable it to be more wearable and more normal looking, and focused on that, and it enables one to track meals, to log exactly what a person's eaten, when they've eaten, how they've eaten. We talked about the whole role about how you chew and weight loss. It's a huge revelation on us, and we're going to see, I think, a lot of discussions about the role of GLP-1s and how people can't really get off them very easily, and the implications on their health because of muscle loss and because of the cost of care, etc., and how we can perhaps drive behavioural interventions. So anyone who's doing behavioural research, chronic neurology is another area. So apart from Parkinson's disease, which is obviously a big one, there's things such as ALS, multiple sclerosis, MS, motor neuron disease. It's a huge area because, again, it's really hard to improve what you can't measure. And current tools for assessing these conditions are either subjective or based on surveys, self-report, etc., or they're just too coarse-grained, in which case a person has to make such a big improvement for them to change their grading. Whereas if you had continuous real-world data, we wouldn't consider, for example, prescribing somebody on antihypertensive based on a single shot figure, or asking them, how does your blood pressure feel, or how does your blood sugar feel? We now have data that people can access in the real world continuously and make proper decisions, and so that's where we need to move in terms of behaviour. Other conditions, so I talked about social interaction. That's obviously a big one as well. We don't really have a good angle to understand the range of what constitutes empathy or an empathetic interaction. I think that's a really wide open space just now. Human-computer interaction is another area as well. A lot of money and time and effort is going into implanting devices in people's brains to help them control things. But actually, a baby knows very, very early on that it has a means to control the world around it through its expressions. It can express, and suddenly, by miracles, the mother comes and picks it up and consoles it through its expression of distress, or its smile can call more attention to it. So we know that there is a way of interacting with technology through the face, and I'm sure that with these new smart glasses that are being developed just now, you'll recognize that you won't necessarily need to talk to your glasses to ask it for things. You can actually have it predict and infer from your behavior what you need at that time. So yeah, it's a hugely exciting space, and anyone who is interested in how we can push things forward and make things better should get in touch, and we're happy to engage.
Charles, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. For those people that do want to learn more about what you're up to or want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do so?
So we're online, emteqlabs.com. We are socials, mostly LinkedIn. We will be doing a bit more engagement publicly, showing some of the capabilities of the technology in the coming weeks and months. Email is info@emteqlabs, EMTEQ labs, LABS.com.
And you mentioned your Substack earlier.
Yeah, I just started. I do very, very sporadically, as you can imagine. Time is quite limited. But yeah, I'm writing the occasional essay about some aspect of human interaction, or the intersection between healthcare interaction and technology, which people may find interesting. I don't know.
I will genuinely subscribe. I find it fascinating. If it's anything like the stories that you've been telling on this podcast, then we're in for a treat. Charles, thank you so much. I'm sure we'll be speaking very soon. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you.